Episode 1. Thank you for downloading this first official episode of the Tin Dog podcast. If you feel the need to contact me or leave me feedback, please visit www.tin-dog.co.uk or email me at tin-dog@hotmail.co.uk. As this is the first show, I thought it an ideal time to talk about the First Doctor, as I've received an email from a new fan of the new series and asked if I could cover the history of some classic shows and recommend a few titles as a starting point. So, let's dive straight in with the very first story. Now, in the beginning, Doctor Who stories had episode titles, rather than, as you would imagine, buying a DVD where it's just one title, which is why the first 4 episodes are usually known as An Unearthly Child, where in real life it's a bit more complicated. You've got An Unearthly Child, which is episode 1, which is, to be fair, classic, and episodes 2, 3, 4, which are particularly dull. Now, episode 1 introduces the Doctor's granddaughter, Susan. Now, granddaughter, yes, I know there's a whole lot of people who are kind of, but the Doctor, he's an asexual being, and he's an alien and all that, but that's a whole different kettle of worms, or can of worms? Either way, something we should really deal with on a different podcast, the Doctor's family. We have Susan, and we have the Doctor. The Doctor, in this first incarnation, is played by William Hartnell. Now, he played the Doctor between 1963 and 1966, so obviously, as you can imagine, it's black and white. Now, at this time, the series was seen as, well, primarily a kids' show. However, like the next 26 years, it was seen as a kids' show by the BBC, but not by the fans. The fans saw it as, well, sci-fi. Good old-fashioned sci-fi. Now, An Unearthly Child is something I would recommend. It's a great starting point. It has a lot of similarities to the new series' first episode, Rose. We are introduced to the Doctor from the point of view of some human beings who experience the Doctor and the TARDIS for the first time. It's an ideal jumping off point. However, it does come, well, it used to come on a VHS with The Cave of Skulls, which was a very dull story. Not a lot happens. The Doctor introduces fire to some cavemen. It really isn't that exciting. However, straight after the Unearthly Child Cave of Skulls caveman story comes what for most people is the definitive Doctor Who story. I mean, this is the first week of 1964, end of 1963. We've got the Daleks turning up. Now, the Daleks are the icon of Doctor Who. I don't really need to say more. There will be a whole podcast dedicated to all 3 versions of history of the Daleks. Yes, I say 3 versions of history. It gets a bit complicated, and they do need to be talked about in quite a bit of depth. But basically, the Daleks is the story of the Doctor, Susan. Oh, sorry, I completely forgot to mention Barbara and Ian. Barbara and Ian are the other companions. At this point, it was very popular for the Doctor to hang around with more than one companion. Now, these are the days when the series was 25 minutes long per episode. So you had 4 companions. Now, Ian and Barbara were in fact Susan's teachers. This is primarily to do with the series' original remit of being largely educational. That's why the teachers represented in the series were a history teacher and a science teacher. That way the children watching the series could experience the places that they went to and the events through the eyes of people who they trusted. That was the original idea. Now, the Daleks, the everyday story of mutated folk and the wars they wage, was followed closely by a very odd story called The Edge of Destruction. Now, whether for budgetary reasons or not, the entire episode takes place inside the TARDIS. Obviously, you're aware of the TARDIS, otherwise you wouldn't be listening to this podcast, so I'm not going to bother explaining all that. Edge of Destruction, the Daleks, and An Unearthly Child now come in a boxed set called The Beginning. And it's a very nice box set. It comes with some fabulous extras, and of course they have used that wonderful vidfire technique that allows everyone to look just a little bit too warm. Then, sadly, the series is followed by a very long story called Marco Polo, not a lot of which survives. You can see bits of that on the DVD release of Lost in Time. Marco Polo is one of the historical stories, again fitting in with the original remit. Keys of Mariners, Aztecs and Censorines, followed by the Reign of Terror, and then Planet of the Giants. They all go on to make a continued narrative. Now, the Aztecs is something I would recommend. I've only owned it myself on VHS because I'm not a very rich person. However, it is a very nice story and deals with the side effects of time travel. If you want to experience Doctor Who in its rawest form, it's very early days. Aztecs is well worth a watch. Of course, after Planet of the Giants comes the Dalek invasion of Earth. Now, the Dalek invasion of Earth and the Daleks were both made into parallel, but not official, Doctor Who films. Well, they were official in the sense that they got the licenses and things, but the character isn't a Time Lord, he's just an Earth-based scientist. He's actually called Doctor Who rather than the Doctor. There's a lot of differences, but the Peter Cushing films are a great way to experience Doctor Who if you're trying to introduce somebody else, some new fans to the series. Now, Daleks Invasion of Earth marks the leaving of the series of Susan. This is, well, it's not the last time we ever see her. We do see her in the Five Doctors, but that's many years later. Now, Dalek Invasion of Earth is followed by The Rescue and The Romans, which were originally available in one VHS boxed set. The Rescue is a 2-episode story. It's fairly obvious to any watcher at all what's going on in that episode, but it's well worth seeing. The Romans, however, is a very odd episode. It smacks more of Carry On than pure science fiction. It tries to be historical, but it ends up falling short in many respects. I wouldn't recommend The Romans. However, The Romans is followed by a story called The Web Planet. Now, I'd recommend The Web Planet, but not for the reasons most people would. I do enjoy The Web Planet. It's a very, very odd story. Basically, the TARDIS materialises on a planet with very large insects. Now, unlike the Planet of the Giants, the TARDIS crew hasn't been shrunk. Sorry, I've just given that away. Which brings us to The Web Planet. Now, The Web Planet I would recommend, mainly because it's one of the oddest Doctor Who stories. Obviously, at this point in the show's career, it was still allowed to be experimental. Now, for those people listening in England, Martin Jarvis plays one of the minor characters. If memory serves, there's characters called the Zarbi. There's giant ants, giant wasps, people in some extremely odd costumes. It's a standard we subjugate you, you must help us kind of storyline, but its delivery is just odd. It's well worth a look. That's followed by The Crusade. Again, episodes of that are available on the Lost in Time box set. It's well worth a purchase because you get to see a large slice of the eras, more like a taster. Sadly, it's what's left of various stories after the BBC wiped many things in the 70s. But again, there should be a whole podcast dedicated to that. Now, you've got the Space Museum. Again, the Space Museum is one of the few stories in Doctor Who which actually deal with time travel as part of the plot, rather than just as a mechanism for getting you to the plot, if you see what I mean. The characters materialise in a museum, and they discover that they are indeed exhibits in their own museum. The Doctor explains things as times jump to track, so in a sense things start repeating themselves. It's quite a neat little story. It's well worth a look, especially if you see it on UK Gold or something like that. Now, you've got the Space Museum followed by The Chase, which is a Dalek story, but not one of the best. It is a series of small stories, well, settings really, where the characters are literally chased by Daleks who also, by this point in their history, rather oddly, have a time machine. The Dalek time machine does make a very, very nice sound, as you could probably hear by the beginning of this programme. Now, The Chase is followed by a very good story called The Time Meddler. I would definitely recommend that. That's The Time Meddler. This introduces, for the first time, somebody else from the Doctor's homeworld, still not referred to as Gallifrey. Now, The Time Meddler is played by Peter Butterworth, who was known for his comedy characterizations. and it's extremely well done. Basically, it also deals with what happens if someone could change history. That's followed by Galaxy 4 and Mission to the Unknown. Now, I'm not particularly familiar with these stories, as indeed with the Mythmakers, although I did buy the Target novelisation as a child. The Mythmakers deals with the Greek myths. Now, this story, I believe, is completely missing, so whether I recommend that to you or not, it doesn't really matter. That is followed by the Daleks Master Plan. Now, a bit like The Chase, it's very complex, it has the Daleks in it, but basically this episode does exactly what it says on the tin. The Daleks have a master plan for domination, and the Doctor has to stop it. Now, again, this is followed by The Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve, a purely historical story. And then there's The Ark. Now, The Ark, I would recommend. That was available on VHS. I can't see it being an issue trying to find a copy. The Ark is a story split in two. One of those generational ships that science fiction authors are very fond of is journeying across the galaxy, I believe at a very slow speed relative. So the Doctor visits it at one period of its history, in episodes 1 and 2, where the humans have a slave race with one eye in the middle of their heads. Yes, you can picture it, and you're probably picturing it slightly better than it was imagined on the screen. And then in the second 2 episodes of the 4-part story, the slave race have become the masters and the humans have become the slaves, and the Doctor has to put things back in a kind of a let's all be friends kind of a way, as well you imagine. Another odd story, sadly with some episodes missing I believe, called The Celestial Toymaker follows that. And then we're into the final run of William Hartnell's stories. The Gunfighters, which has, apart from Timelash perhaps with Colin Baker, been noted as one of the worst Doctor Who stories of all time. I don't know whether it really deserves this, but many people would argue it would, followed by The Savages and The War Machines. Now, The War Machines is a very, very nice story. It's set in 1960s swinging London, so it's got a bit of an Austin Powers feel to it, but they do have some very nice robots in it, and a supercomputer called Wotan. And what do supercomputers do? Yes, they try and take over the world. This one uses, of course, something very similar to the internet, which is nicely preordained. Now, there's only 2 stories left in William's reign as the Doctor: The Smugglers and the final story, The 10th Planet. Now, The 10th Planet being the end of the Hartnell era and the beginning of something marvellous with regeneration, but it also marks the introduction of the Cybermen. The Cybermen will have their own podcast dedicated to them because their history is so incredibly complicated that it's had books dedicated to it. Right, just to recap, we've got some recommendations. The Unearthly Child, Episode 1, The Daleks, marvellous story, and Edge of Destruction. Followed by, for me personally, I would recommend The Aztecs, possibly Daleks' Invasion of Earth, The Web Planet, Time Meddler, The Ark, The War Machines, and of course The 10th Planet. Now, Episode 4 of The 10th Planet has been lost, but it has been recreated using telesnaps and sound recorded at the time off the TV. Now, the fact that some of these episodes is lost really shows the English up for what they are. Well, the BBC anyway. Can you imagine Star Trek losing episodes? I don't know, I don't think so. But that's a personal issue for every single Doctor Who fan. So, I hope you've enjoyed this first podcast, and if you'd like to contact me, I'm available at tin-dog@hotmail.co.uk. Until next time, be seeing you.